The morning my son called to tell me he'd been named regional director, I was standing in my kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, still wearing my nursing scrubs from the overnight shift. My coffee was going cold on the counter. My feet ached the way they'd ached every morning for the past 31 years, and when I heard his voice, so proud, so full of light, I sat down on the linoleum floor and cried. Not because I was sad, because I remembered every single thing it cost to get him there. I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. I am 63 years old. I have worked the night shift, the double shift, the holiday shift, and the shift nobody else wanted. I have eaten sandwiches in hospital break rooms at 2 in the morning and driven home in the dark with my eyes burning. I have done all of it quietly, without complaint, because my son was watching. And everything I did so he would never have to. His name is Daniel. He was 7 years old when his father left. I won't spend too much time on that part, because it isn't really the story I'm here to tell. What you need to know is this. My husband walked out of our house on a Tuesday morning in October, and by Friday, he had emptied our joint savings account and moved in with a woman he worked with. Daniel was in 2nd grade. He still had a Toy Story backpack. He still called me Mama instead of Mom. I filed for divorce. I picked up extra shifts. I moved us into a smaller house on the east side of town, one with a yard just big enough for Daniel to kick a soccer ball around, which mattered to me more than I can explain. I wanted him to have somewhere to run. His father paid child support for about 8 months and then stopped. The courts chased it for a while. I stopped chasing. I didn't have the energy. And I decided early on that I would not let bitterness take up space in the house where my son was growing up, so I let it go. I worked harder. I made it enough. And it was enough. Somehow, improbably, it was enough. Daniel was a quiet, serious kid who turned into a quiet, serious man. He ran track in high school. He won a partial scholarship to Ohio State. I took out a loan for the rest, and I paid it off the same way I paid off everything else, slowly, methodically, one paycheck at a time. He graduated in 3.5 years with a degree in business administration and a job offer from a logistics company called Crestline Solutions, based out of Columbus. I stood at his graduation in a blue dress I'd bought on clearance, and I thought, this is the moment. This is what it was all for. And for a few years, it really did feel that way. Daniel moved to Columbus. He worked hard, the way I'd raised him to work hard. He got promoted twice in 4 years. He called me every Sunday without fail, and he came home for Christmas and always brought me flowers, which his father never once did in 11 years of marriage. My son knew how to honor people. I had made sure of that. Then he met her. Her name is Jessica. She's warm and sharp and laughs too loud in the best possible way, and I loved her from the moment Daniel brought her home. She worked in marketing at a company downtown, and she had this way of asking questions, real questions, the kind where she actually listened to the answer that made you feel seen. I used to sit across from her at my kitchen table and think, where did you come from, and how did we get lucky enough to find you? They dated for 2 years. Then Daniel proposed on a hiking trail outside of Hocking Hills, at a spot where apparently Jessica had mentioned once, just once, in passing, that she'd like to get engaged someday. He'd remembered. He'd planned it for months. He got down on one knee on a flat rock overlooking the gorge, and she said yes before he finished the question. I cried when he told me. Happy tears. Pure ones. The kind you don't have to blink away. Then he told me her last name, Jessica Hargrove, and the room went very quiet inside my chest. I need to go back now, back about 25 years, to a version of myself I don't visit often. When Daniel was still small, and I was still trying to figure out how to be a single mother on a nurse's salary in a mid-sized Ohio city, I worked for a while at a private medical clinic on the north side of Dayton. It was better pay than the hospital, better hours too. And for a couple of years, it felt like things were finally stabilizing. The clinic was owned and operated by a man named Richard Hargrove. He was in his 50s then, silver-haired, well-dressed, the kind of man who shook hands too firmly and held eye contact a beat too long, like he wanted to make sure you understood who was in charge. He had a wife who came to the Christmas party every year and smiled at everyone and never seemed to actually look at anyone. He had 2 sons who worked in various parts of his business, and he had a way of running that clinic that I came to understand, over time, was not entirely above board. I was there for almost 3 years before I saw it clearly. The billing irregularities, the patients whose records didn't match their treatments, the insurance claims filed for procedures that hadn't happened. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you could explain away if you wanted to. But I was a nurse, and nurses notice. We are trained to notice. Our entire job is to look carefully at things that other people overlook. I brought it to my supervisor. My supervisor told me to keep my head down. 2 weeks later, my position was eliminated. Richard Hargrove didn't fire me. He was too smart for that. He restructured. My role no longer existed. It was all very clean and very legal, and very much designed to make sure I had nothing to take to anyone. I was 37 years old with a 9-year-old son and no job. I found another position at a hospital across town. I rebuilt. I moved on, but I kept copies of everything I had seen. Printed records, notes I had written in my own handwriting, dates and amounts and names. I kept them in a manila folder inside a fireproof lockbox under my bed, and every few years I would take them out and look at them and think, not yet, but someday. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. Justice doesn't usually knock on your door. I knew that, but I also knew that men like Richard Hargrove eventually overreach, and when they do, they need people like me, people who have been waiting quietly with documentation, to be ready. So I stayed ready. And then my son told me he was marrying Richard Hargrove's daughter-in-law. Not his daughter. Jessica was the girlfriend, now the fiancée, of Richard's younger son, Thomas, which made Richard Hargrove my son's future grandfather-in-law, which meant he would be at the engagement party, the rehearsal dinner, the wedding. He would be in every room where my son's happiness lived. I did not tell Daniel. I have asked myself many times whether that was the right choice, and I still don't have a clean answer. What I knew was this: Daniel was happy. He was genuinely, fully happy in a way I had worked his entire life to make possible. Jessica was not her grandfather. Thomas, from what I could see, was nothing like his father, and the documentation I had was old. 25 years old. The clinic had closed. Richard had moved his money into commercial real estate. Whatever I had, I didn't know yet if it was enough or if it still mattered to anyone. So I chose to watch, to wait, to be present for my son's joy and stay alert to everything else. I met Richard Hargrove at the engagement party held at Thomas and Jessica's condo in Columbus. He was in his late 70s now, still silver-haired, still the firm handshake, still the eye contact a beat too long. He looked at me the way powerful men look at women my age, without seeing me at all. He did not recognize me. Of course he didn't. I was nobody to him. I had been a nurse at a small clinic for 3 years, a quarter-century ago. Women like me do not register for men like him. We are background. We are furniture. We are the people who make things run while someone else takes the credit and the profit. I smiled at him and said it was wonderful to meet him and moved to the other side of the room. I watched him work the party. Hands on shoulders, loud laughter, subtle corrections to things Thomas said, delivered as jokes but landing as something else. I watched Jessica's face when he spoke to her, polite and careful, the face of someone who had learned to be pleasant in the presence of a difficult man. I filed all of it away. Over the months leading up to the wedding, I made some calls. It turned out Richard Hargrove had not become more careful with age. He had simply moved his operations to a larger scale. There had been complaints filed with the state, not prosecuted, because complaints without documentation tend to disappear when the man being complained about has good lawyers. There was a former business partner, We'd settled a civil suit out of court and signed a non-disclosure agreement, and then, apparently, decided he didn't care about the NDA anymore when I reached him through a contact of a contact and asked him very specific questions in a very specific questions in a very specific order. There was also a journalist. Her name was Carla, and she had been looking into Richard Hargrove's real estate dealings for almost 2 years. She had pieces. She didn't have enough. She needed someone with first-hand knowledge of the original pattern, the early behavior, the documentation that would establish a clear through line from who he had been to who he still was. I had first-hand knowledge. I had documentation. And I had, it turned out, been waiting for exactly the right moment. We met 3 times before the wedding. By the 3rd meeting, she had enough for a story. It would run the week after the wedding. We agreed on that, because whatever I felt about Richard Hargrove, I was not going to let anything touch Daniel and Jessica's day. The wedding would be theirs. What came after would be justice. But I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve the honest version. I didn't plan what happened at the reception. Or, at least I didn't fully plan it. Some things simply arrive, and you either meet them or you don't. The wedding was held at an estate venue outside of Columbus on the 2nd Saturday in June. 220 guests. String lights and white roses, and Jessica in a dress that made my son look at her like she was the most astonishing thing he had ever seen. I sat in the 2nd row, which was where I'd been asked to sit, and I watched my son marry someone who loved him, and I held it together through the entire ceremony by pressing my thumbnail into the inside of my wrist every time I felt my throat tighten. I made it. He was married. He was happy. The reception was in the adjacent ballroom, and for the first hour it was exactly what it should have been. Beautiful and loud and full of people eating and dancing and finding each other across crowded rooms. I danced with Daniel. I danced with Jessica. I told her she was the best thing that had ever chosen my son, and I meant every word. Then came the toasts. Thomas gave a toast that was genuinely wonderful, funny and warm, and specifically about Jessica in a way that made it clear he actually knew her. Jessica's mother went next and made everyone cry. Then the best man, then 2 college friends of Jessica's. And then Richard Hargrove stood up. He had not been on the program. I want you to understand that. No one had asked him to speak. He simply stood up, the way men like him stand up, as if the floor had always been theirs, and the only question was when they would choose to claim it. He spoke for several minutes about the Hargrove family, about their legacy, about Thomas's achievements. He talked about the values they had built their success upon. He said the words hard work and integrity and earned it more times than I could count. And then he looked across the room at me. He still didn't know who I was. I want to be clear about that. He looked at me the way he had looked at me at the engagement party, not seeing me, just registering my presence as the mother of the groom, which in his mind placed me in a category of person who required acknowledgement but not respect. He said with a smile that had probably worked on a lot of rooms over the years, that he hoped Daniel came from good stock, because the Hargrove side had certainly held up their end. He laughed. A few people laughed nervously with him. My son's jaw tightened. Jessica's mother looked at her plate. Jessica looked at me. I had not planned to stand up. But I was on my feet before I made a conscious decision to move. And once I was standing, it was the most natural thing in the world. I said, I'd like to say a few words, if you don't mind. And because I am 63 years old and I have the voice of a woman who has spent 3 decades telling doctors twice her age when they are wrong, the room went quiet. I introduced myself. I said I was Daniel's mother. I said I had raised him alone, from the time he was 7 years old, on a nurse's salary, through the night shifts and the missed school plays and the years when I calculated grocery trips to the exact dollar to make sure we never ran short. I said he was the best thing I had ever done and that he had become the best man I had ever known and that I was certain, absolutely certain, that he had enough integrity for every room he would ever walk into. And then I paused. And I looked at Richard Hargrove. And I said, I actually know quite a bit about legacy and what it's built on. I worked for a medical clinic on the north side of Dayton from 1998 to 2001. I think you know the one. The room was very quiet. His face, and I will remember this for the rest of my life, went through about 4 different expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, calculation, and then something I can only describe as the specific fear of a man who has spent decades believing himself untouchable and has just heard, in the middle of a wedding reception in front of 220 people, a sentence that tells him the untouchable part may no longer apply. I did not say anything further about the clinic. I did not need to. That sentence was not the ending. It was the beginning. The story Carla had written would come out in 4 days. The former business partner had already given his on-record statement. The documentation in my manila folder had been scanned and submitted and was now in hands far more legally capable than mine. What I said next was this: I have held on to certain things for a very long time, waiting for the right moment to put them where they belong. I am happy to tell you that the moment has arrived, and I am even happier that it will not touch a single person in this room who doesn't deserve it. Then I raised my glass to Daniel and Jessica, and I said, to my son and my daughter, may your life together be built on things that actually last. And I sat down. The room took a moment to find itself. Then someone started clapping. I don't know who, someone at a table near the back. And it spread, and people were on their feet. And my son was crossing the room toward me with his eyes bright, and he hugged me in the way he used to hug me when he was small, with his whole body, holding on. Richard Hargrove left the reception 40 minutes later. He did not say goodbye. 4 days after the wedding, Carla's story ran in a Columbus publication with regional reach, and by the end of the week it had been picked up by 2 larger outlets. The former business partner's statements were thorough. My documentation established the early pattern that the investigators had been trying to trace. Within 2 weeks, there were 3 separate legal inquiries opened into Richard Hargrove's real estate holdings. I am not going to sit here and tell you that justice is always complete. I don't know yet how this ends for him legally. These things move slowly, and I have learned to be patient. But I will tell you what I do know. I know that Thomas called me 10 days after the wedding. He was quiet, on the phone, and I could tell he was working through something difficult, and I let him take his time. He said he had heard things about his grandfather before, pieces, rumors, things that never quite came to anything. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how to hold all of it. I told him that was okay. That honesty about the people we come from is one of the hardest things a person can do, and that doing it anyway is exactly the kind of integrity his wife had always had, and that I hoped he knew we were family now, the real kind, and that meant I was on his side. He cried a little. I let him. I know that Jessica called me the day the story ran and said she had 2 things to tell me. The first was that she had been quietly documenting her grandfather's behavior toward Thomas for 3 years, in case it ever became relevant to a legal proceeding, and she wanted me to know that my documentation and hers were now with the same legal team. The second thing was that she was 13 weeks pregnant. I held the phone to my chest for a long moment after that call. Standing again in my kitchen in Dayton, and a different pair of scrubs with the same cup of cooling coffee on the counter, and I thought about a 9-year-old boy with a Toy Story backpack who used to kick a soccer ball in a small backyard on the east side of town, and I thought about all the night shifts and all the calculated grocery trips and all the years of staying quiet and staying ready and staying present. I thought about a manila folder under a bed, about a journalist who asked good questions, about a former business partner who turned out to still have a conscience, about a woman at a wedding who finally got to stand up. There are things you carry for a long time before you know what they're for. You carry them and you don't complain, and you don't let them make you bitter, and you don't stop believing that the moment will come when carrying them will mean something. You just keep them in a fireproof box, and you keep going. And you trust that people like Richard Hargrove always, eventually, overreach. I am going to be a grandmother. My son is happy. I am 63 years old, and I am still wearing my scrubs, and my coffee is still going cold, and outside my kitchen window the maple tree in the backyard is coming into leaf. The same maple tree Daniel used to climb when he was 10 and fearless and entirely certain that I would catch him if he fell. I always would have. I always did.